Most people who grew up in the 80s or grew up with the NES and the Super Nintendo have memories of playing LJN games or playing with their toys. My friends and I rented quite a few of their games in the early 1990s, and one of my friends actually owned at least two LJN games that I'm aware of. In the 2000s, the perception of LJN and their games, they kind of shifted a little bit with online reviewers and also online comedy shows, because many of these games are not very good, but they are fun to laugh at. It wasn't just the Angry Video Game Nerd web series that, kind of shifted people's minds on LJN. There were also quite a few bloggers as well. It just seemed like the 2000s was a great time for somebody who wanted to, gain some fame from just shitting on old games, whether or not they actually played them or anything like that. It just felt like everybody jumped on the bandwagon of doing that. Maybe it was because people started to kind of remember a lot of the games that they played when they were a kid, and yeah, these were some of the worst. But they didn't just do video games, they also did toys as well, so let's get into a little history of LJN. LJN has a pretty long history of being a toy manufacturer before they got into video games and before they were bought by Acclaim. They made licensed toys for the WWF, also E.T., a few other movies, and they also had their own paintball guns, and probably the most infamous was the Enertech water guns, which led to their toy business kind of getting shut down after they were bought by Acclaim. LJN had been founded in 1967 by Jack Friedman, and then they were purchased in 1985 by MCA. They were, getting into video games around that time, and then in the late 80s, early 90s, they were bought up by Acclaim, so Acclaim could release more games on the NES. That's a very brief overview of what they did. I don't really remember their toys all that much. A friend of mine had their wrestling figures, but for the most part, I did not play with their toys. I really only remember them as being a video game company. Because I haven't mentioned this yet, I feel like I need to reinforce the fact that LJN was a publisher. They did not actually make any of their games. They did have the license to quite a few popular movies, and a few of them seemed a little odd, like Jaws, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and probably some other R-rated movies that I'm completely forgetting about. And then they also had a bunch of games that were based on movies that were more geared towards kids, like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and some other things like that. I'm not sure if Back to the Future was or not, but let's just say it was. Karate Kid definitely was. For games like Jaws and Friday the 13th, that was actually how I learned about the movies. I vaguely knew that they existed, but I was way too young to actually watch them when I played these games, so playing them on the NES, that was the way I learned about a lot of horror movies and other movies that I hadn't seen before. This also would include Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and really anything else. I think I saw Karate Kid before I attempted to play the game, which is probably the nicest thing I can say about most of LJN's games, is I attempted to play them when I was a kid. For some of these movies, like Karate Kid, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and Back to the Future, they were movies that my family would rent on the weekends. We didn't have a whole lot of money, so we almost never went to the movie theater. It was just kind of a rarity if we did. So most of the time, I would see these, in the rental store. We might rent them, or we might rent the video game and then rent the movie later. It happened quite a bit. I actually remember playing Who Framed Roger Rabbit with my friend Eric. He owned that game as well as TNC Surf Design. And it seemed like every summer or so, Eric would somehow convince us that we should play Who Framed Roger Rabbit and try to beat the game because he allegedly knew how to beat it. And we would play it for about a half an hour and then get sick of it and turn it off and go do something else. Those are really the only memories I have of that game is, trying to play it with my friends and then just getting bored and moving on to something else. I could actually say that about all of LJN's games. We would try to play them, get sick of it, and just do anything else. Normally go outside, but you never know. My opinions on a few of these games have actually changed now that I know how to play them. Stuff like Jaws and Friday the 13th, I think they're a lot more fun than when I played them as a kid, just because I've been able to figure out how the game expects you to play it. I don't think either of them are good, but they're a lot more fun than what I remember them being. One thing about this whole genre of video games, like their movie-based games, they took an idea of the movie and then tried to make something out of it. And I don't think it always worked out. Some of them, when you look at them in retrospect, it's like, oh, okay. Like with Jaws, they were basing it off the fourth movie in the franchise. And I don't think anybody really would have picked up on that. It just seems really strange that it would be called Jaws, but based off of Jaws the Revenge. I'm guessing they probably wanted to distance the game from Jaws the Revenge as much as they could, but whatever. Let's go into the next genre that they released, at least the ones that I remember playing, and I played a lot of these recently. That was the wrestling games that they made. At this point, I have played all the wrestling games published by LJN that I am aware of. I think there might be some on the Game Gear that I just didn't get to for whatever reason. Maybe I'll come back and play them at some point, but I'm not going to really commit to that. Many of them were played when I was going through the wrestling games on the NES, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and Game Boy. These games are really the epitome of what you should expect from an LJN published game. The same developer made some of the games, like on the Super Nintendo and on the Sega Genesis, and while I don't like those all that much, they at least were consistent. That is not something that you can say about the Game Boy or the NES. They had just a revolving door of developers. Each game is fairly different, but still, mediocre at best. Yeah, it's a bit of a mess. The one thing I could really say about the NES games, they're kind of hit or miss. As I mentioned, a different developer was used for, I think, each game. I don't know if any developer did 2 games in a row or anything like that. The quality is just all over the place with them. There are a couple that I like more than what most people do, but I wouldn't say any of them are good. The games on the Game Boy are even more inconsistent. They are what you should expect from a game on the handheld. There are some that are just downright horrible ports of console games. I would say that probably the first WWF Superstars is probably my favorite out of all of them, just because that one felt somewhat, original and different from everything else. A few of the games were just really crappy ports of a game that was fairly average at best. This is actually where our story takes kind of an odd twist, because LJN didn't publish the wrestling games on the Sega Genesis. Acclaim decided to use Flying Edge for that, which is basically just another version of LJN. It did the exact same thing that LJN did under the Acclaim banner, and they actually published better games than what LJN did, so that was kind of interesting. From a historical context, this brings us up to about the mid-1990s, and that was when Acclaim started winding LJN down. The company just wasn't used again until Spirit of Speed on the Dreamcast. I didn't even realize that LJN published many of these games until much, much later, when I, started collecting retro games and just happened to stumble across that little rainbow logo, and I had some nostalgia for the NES games, but for the most part, I had completely forgotten about them. They're just a weird company, but they did produce more than just wrestling games and movie-based games. They also did a bunch of superhero games. Their superhero games are really some of the most disappointing sets of games in the LJN library. While they aren't as bad as the movie-based games, one of them is the worst game that they ever published, and it's one of the worst games on the NES. This category has, honestly, some of the better games that they published as well, but yeah, you can't really get past one of them, which is really freaking awful. X-Men on the NES is one of the worst games that I have ever played. It's truly an awful game that feels more like a prototype. Well, this is, in my opinion, the worst game that they published, not only on the NES, but just overall. They also published The Punisher and Spider-Man, which honestly are better games. I don't like their Spider-Man game on the NES, but the beat-em-ups they made for the Super Nintendo, that they published for the Super Nintendo, those are some of their better games. And I think The Punisher on the NES is one of their better games, too. It at least is, functional and a lot more fun to play than some of their other games. And then there was one that I forgot about, because I tend to forget about the Game Boy. The Punisher game on the Game Boy is also very good. It's not as good, or at least as creative, as the NES version, but the Game Boy version of this is very good as well. There's also a little cameo from Spider-Man in it, so that's always fun. Really, the Spider-Man games and some of the X-Men games later on, those are much better LJN published games than most of what they did on the NES. Spider-Man, just in general, fared much better than the X-Men games. Eventually, the developers just turned them into beat-em-ups, which is honestly where they should have been the entire time, because a lot of their side-scrollers, just in general, were not very good. As someone who really wasn't into comics growing up, these video games and also the TV shows, those are really how I knew about a lot of these characters. It's kind of sad in some ways that this is how I found out about a lot of them. I don't think I had played the Konami game or the Sega game for X-Men and Spider-Man, respectively. I played a lot of these on the NES first because I didn't live anywhere near an arcade. And yeah, they were not really the best representation of what a superhero game could be, especially when you compare them to, what DC had at the time with the Batman game, which is an amazing NES game. And even the Superman game is better than what, they were putting out on the NES from LJN. To circle back to the X-Men game, Jesus Christ, this thing is annoying as all hell. I'm sure people have beaten it. I just could not, suffer through any more of it than what I did. It really feels like they just published a prototype. It doesn't really make any sense. It's not very good. And at this point, I don't think we even know who the developer is. It's just that strange of a game. I honestly could find very few redeeming qualities about it, aside from the fact that you could play as the X-Men. Honestly, I would rather play the Wolverine game that they published, as opposed to going through any more of just the Uncanny X-Men or Marvel's X-Men, depending on which review you want to look at or who you want to read about, because they couldn't even figure out what they wanted to call the damn game. I'll just move on to something else before I turn this into a rant about, a crappy NES game. Going back and playing a lot of these games, It just seemed like LJN and Acclaim never really cared about the quality of what they were putting out. Some of the developers seem to have used the publisher as a means to just experiment with different ideas. This is the one thing that I kind of like about their games. Stuff like Jaws and Friday the 13th, and even Back to the Future, they're very unique games. The developers took some chances, and well, not all of them worked out. They were at least, trying to do something different than what was on the NES. This is what makes some of the LJN published games kind of stand out in a good way. Not all of them, but at least a few of them stand out in a good way. I enjoy most of them, even, if I can admit that they aren't all that great. There are a couple of them that I enjoy playing. And there are a whole bunch of other ones that I enjoy laughing at while I'm playing it, or laughing while other people are playing it. It's just a game. You're supposed to be having fun with them, and I think that gets lost a few times. They're, not good by any stretch of the means. Some of them are fairly average, and others are just weird. And that's kind of something I like about them. They're strange games that, took chances, did something different. It didn't work out, and I shouldn't say many, some of the developers went on to do much better things than what they put out, from LJN. It was just a gig for them to get money to keep their studios going, and I can't really blame them for that, because a lot of these games are just kind of crap. A few of them are fun to play, or at least fun to go back and revisit every once in a while. But I think all of them are kind of fun to just laugh at, as long as you don't take them seriously. I can think of a handful of good games that LJN published, and several that I think are, fun to just poke fun at, because that's kind of what they deserve. Even a bad game can be something that brings you some enjoyment, and I think that's something that people forget about from time to time. LJN has a fairly deserved reputation online. Most of it is due to the reviewers in the 2000s having a negative impact on them, and even putting that aside, overall their games really aren't good. It does feel like everyone has memories of playing these games, which is always fun. I have fond memories of playing the games with my friends, not necessarily of the games themselves. So, how do you want to remember these games? I would like to think about all the fun times I had when I was playing them with my friends, and some of the joys of revisiting them, just to kind of remind myself of the fun that I had as a kid. These are definitely not going to show up on one of my favorites lists, and a few of them deserve their place as some of the worst games that I've ever played, but I think there's something fun about it, going back and revisiting these games and just seeing what they had to offer at the time, and seeing what developers, especially those that are more well-known now, like Atlas and Rare, what they were doing back in the 80s and early 90s when they were getting their start. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.